Raised on the finest of American rock and roll, from Chuck Berry, Carl Perkins, Bo Diddley, Elvis Presley, Fats Domino, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, and Buddy Holly.
From October the 9th, happy birthday, John.
It's John Lennon on another vinyl show.
Ike Frazier Industries presents another vinyl show with Ike Frazier.
Born October 9th, 1940, during World War II, John Lennon, seen here with his mother Julia, who was killed by a hit-and-run driver, his father, a layabout, Fred Lennon. John was raised by Mimi and George, and here we see him with his little puppy. And as he grew up with this deep interest in rock and roll, he was playing with his band, the Quarrymen, and he met a young Paul McCartney on July 6, 1957. Instantly asking him to join his band, the Quarrymen. The next day, Paul McCartney said yeah, and the foundation of the Beatles were born because Paul brought his friend George Harrison along. And when George showed up, that made them a pretty good trio right there. John and Paul started writing songs, and they got a drummer in Pete Best. Brian Epstein decided that he would be their manager. He kind of thought they were good looking and groovy. And here we see the Beatles with Pete Best. And then Brian took them to see George Martin, and Sir George Martin signed the Beatles to Parlophone, an EMI subsidiary, and they released their very first single in October of 1962, Love Me Do, and that went to number 17 in the UK pop charts. Their next single, Please Please Me, went to number 2, according to some charts, but their first album, of course, was number 1 for an incredibly long time. Here we see the very rare gold label stereo from 1963, and they toured Sweden. The first time they leave the UK, they go to the wonderful land of Sweden, and when they get back, they are so popular, they have a Royal Command performance. And here's John. Paula? Now, with the big success of the Royal Command performance, their second LP came out with the Beatles. Then they had to go straight to France, and of course the Beatles were starting to get pretty popular in France because their records had just started coming out in 1963 there. And here we see John with Cynthia. They got married and had a wonderful young man named Julian. And here they are flying to America with Phil Spector riding the plane. A lot of people don't know that Phil Spector was on the plane with them to the UK, to the USA. And their first performances in the USA are headed up by an appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. And I Want to Hold Your Hand takes the number 1 spot, and the corresponding album here in the USA, Meet the Beatles, is also in the number 1 spot. And the Beatles land here in America.
No, we need money first.
They perform on Ed Sullivan, and it is quite a big success. Here we see John with Julian and Cynthia, and we see him with George and Mimi right here. So that is John's basic family from this time period. Then they release A Hard Day's Night, their first movie and their first full soundtrack album. Then it is off to Australia, where they're met by some of the biggest crowds of all time. They get back home, they have to hurry and record Beatles for Sale, which is released towards the end of the year for Christmas in '64. Now, with all this going on, the Beatles are going to get the MBE. So, members of the British Empire, the Beatles. Some people are upset about it, some people are not upset about it. Either way, they can't change history. Then it's back to France for more shows with our good friends over there in France. And from France, then they go to Italy, and the Beatles perform a number of shows in Italy. And then from Italy, they go to Franco's Spain. And Franco's not the biggest fan of the Beatles, but he lets them come to the country, and he would kind of mess with them later a little bit. And then they go to the United States for their second tour of America. Now, here they are performing all the songs from the previous albums, but they have to head back really quick because they have to record the soundtrack for the Help album. And after Help is released, they play Shea Stadium, the first huge rock show. As John Lennon said, it was really the very first happening of the 60s. And if you think about it, he's probably right, because nobody could hear him. The fans were screaming. You could watch it on TV and hear it, but then back to the UK for a few shows there, and the release of their great album, Rubber Soul, December of 65. Everybody loves Rubber Soul. But in the United States, we took a few of those tracks and mixed them with a couple other tracks and stole some tracks from Revolver and came up with Yesterday and Today, the very rare Butcher cover that John was actually a big fan of. And then it's time to go off again. And now the Beatles are on tour in 1966. They go to Germany, and they are met by some of their old friends from 1962 who don't quite have good reputations. And then they go from there to Japan. In Japan, there is also controversy because people don't want the Beatles playing at the Budokan. Then, from Japan to the Philippines for even more trouble for what John Lennon described as a Woodstock-like crowd of over 200,000 people coming to see the Beatles in the Philippines. They get out of the Philippines as quick as they can, and when they get back home, they're like, you know what? We cannot really do this much longer. But Paul and Ringo still want to tour. They're still into it. And Revolver is released. And it's time to go back to America again for a summer tour. And this tour will be the Beatles' final tour. And it will end at Candlestick Park, August 1966. And here we'll see the Beatles backstage. And John says,
silly to be in America and for none of them to mention Vietnam as if nothing was happening.
But why should they ask you about it? You're successful.
Yeah, that's that is the thing. Because Americans always ask showbiz people what they think about it. So do the British, you know. Showbiz, you know how it is. But I mean, you've just got to, you can't just keep quiet about anything that's going on in the world unless you're a monk. Sorry, monks, I didn't mean it. I meant actually.
So Candlestick Park arrives, and we see here that all the Beatles know this will be their final show, and John takes a very early selfie. August 29th, 1966, they're leaving stage, and they will not return. Heading to the UK to get a little rest. They're like, let's just rest a little while. Spain, what's going on in Spain? Well, John Lennon went to Spain after the tour, and he decided to work on a film with Dick Lester, and that was How I Won the War, as he plays Sergeant Gripweed. And we'll see John here in a second in his military outfit. He looks pretty convincing right there. And then from Spain, John goes back to the UK because vacation time is over and Beatles need to work.
They're going to go their own ways in 1967.
They could be, you know, on our own or together. We're always involved with each other, whatever we're doing.
These early sessions for Sgt. Pepper create one of the greatest records of all time, Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, and in June, Sgt. Pepper arrives. Sgt. Pepper takes the world by storm. Brian Epstein feels a little sidelined because the Beatles aren't touring, and now they're hanging out with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Then they get the terrible news that Brian Epstein has died at the age of 32. Paul tries to get everybody together. They make Magical Mystery Tour as an EP in the UK and a full-length album in America with added singles. And they go back to India to learn from the Maharishi. When they return from India, they're ready to start their own company, Apple, which will be the master of all of their projects. Yoko Ono comes along. Now, John met her in 66, but they really get together in 68. During the release of the White Album. Then you got Two Virgins. Two Virgins came out in 1969. The Beatles tried to make a new record. Get Back turns into Let It Be. They play their last show on the rooftop. In May, Life with the Lions comes out on the Zapple label. But unfortunately, Zapple only puts 2 albums out before Apple's managing director, Mr. Alan Klein, shuts it down. Then, the Beatles decide that, well, it's probably about that time. And John goes and records on his honeymoon, Give Peace a Chance, a very powerful single. And here we see the Beatles again, where they've signed their new contract with Capitol Records, and Abbey Road is released in September of 1969. John wants the next Beatles single to be Cold Turkey, and the other Beatles do not. So he releases it as a solo single, then releases the wedding album after that, and here's what John has to say.
You were saying that in America they're so serious about the protest movement.
Yes, they are.
But they were so flippant that they were singing a happy-go-lucky song, which happens to be one I wrote. And I'm glad they sang it. And when I get there, I'll sing it with them when I get in. And that was a message from me to America or to anywhere, that I used my songwriting ability to write a song that we could all sing together. And I'm proud that they sang it at the Moratorium. I wouldn't have cared if they'd sang We Shall Overcome, but it just so happens they sang that, and I'm proud of it. And I'll be glad to go there and sing with them.
And released in December, it's Live Peace in Toronto by the Plastic Ono Band.
Phil's, I believe, is a great artist. But like all great artists, he's very neurotic.
Phil produces the hit single Instant Karma, a great success in America. But in April, Paul McCartney announces that he's leaving the Beatles. Then in May, the Beatles' last album, Let It Be, comes out. John gets a book in the mail called Primal Scream, and he heads to California for therapy. And when he gets back to England, he creates the John Lennon Plastic Ono Band record. Sometimes he called it Primal Scream. Here we see Yoko, John, and Phil producing the next set of recordings. They head to New York City to do some overdubs, and that album would become Imagine, one of John's greatest albums and a very popular seller through and through. Here we see Yoko, John, and Phil again because their next project will be Sometime in New York City. And here we see the Sometime in New York City album. After that, in early 73, they buy an apartment in the Dakota in New York City, and John will never return to the UK. Late in 73, inspired by Yoko's album, John releases Mind Games, which has a top 20 single. John and Yoko separate, and John meets up with May Pang, and they go to California, and they party, and then Paul and John get to hang out together in 1974. Here we see John and May Pang going out for a night on the town, all dressed up. And the next record he releases is Walls and Bridges, with the only #1 single in his lifetime, Whatever Gets You Through the Night. John Lennon again works with Phil, that's the rock and roll record. And he gets back with Yoko and they have a baby, little baby Sean, so cute right there. And John releases Shaved Fish, his greatest hits collection, to kind of wrap up the solo period. During his 5 years off, Yoko and Alan Klein reach a deal, and they finish that up in 77. They go to Japan every summer, having a great time. John takes a sailing trip in 80 that rebuilds his confidence, and he is ready to record. Here we see him showing Sean the recording studio. They make a great first single for the album, Just Like Starting Over, with tiny little bells to offset the big bells of Mother. And the corresponding album, Double Fantasy, is already in top 20. Here we see John getting ready to make the video for the second single. And we see Yoko and John here leaving the Dakota. And unfortunately, we all know the terrible, sad events of December 8th, 1980. We don't need to go into any of that sadness or bitterness because this is a celebration. And all the people of New York City came out to support Yoko. And after a number of years and some mixing, his first posthumous album, Milk and Honey, came out with Nobody Told Me. In 86, we had Live in New York City, which was a great album. We also got in 86 Men Love Avenue, which was also a pretty great album with all unreleased tracks. 1988, his film that he narrates himself, Imagine, comes out to great success. The John Lennon Legend album keeps the legend going. The anthology box is 4 CDs of unreleased material, and acoustic has his demos on it. But John was a human just like the rest of us, good, bad, foibles, everything that we have to offer. He lived so many lives in that small 40 years, and I just say that it's not enough. We miss him, and we dedicate this video to him. I just can't believe that he has been gone for 45 years now, my friends. But he is with us forever, because here we see 1+1 just came out for his birthday today. God bless you guys, and God bless John Lennon.